Don't be afraid. Welcome back to Cultural Default for the Part 3 discussion of The Grey. Parts 1 and 2 are linked in the description below. Wolves approach in the night, and Otway and the other survivors hold their ground with fire. The reflective eyes of many wolves stare back before retreating, and the survivors are able to take rest. I'm reminded of two things here. First, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, where keeping the fire alive is a running theme, maintaining hope in a hopeless environment. The second is Nietzsche's oft-quoted, "Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster, and if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you." The film gives us a near literal example of both of these. Otway again dreams of his wife. After being told, yet again, not to be afraid, there's a cut to him waking to see another survivor on guard. Burke, played by Nonso Enozi. I had to pause and consider the meaning of this scene. Pacing-wise, it's a slower moment to recover from the earlier tension of the plane crash. But Otway tells Burke not to fall asleep, foreshadowing how he will later die, succumbing to hypothermia. Again, Otway foresees the passage to death, or literally just needs the man to stay alive and stand watch within the story, or both. But what's the point of these characters? Are they here to be picked off one by one like victims in a slasher film? Possibly. Soon after that scene, one of the company goes a little too far from the fire to relieve himself, and is picked off in horror style befitting a Friday the 13th film. Does their gradual erasure, much more on that to come, increase the isolation, the removal from society and its purpose? Otway could have been the sole survivor, but instead there are others, and he assumes leadership. He assumes to know that these wolves will unrelentingly come for them. As he describes it, the men don't belong here. If the confines of where we belong in nature were where we found ourselves, would we have ever ventured out of the caves? Could we even create civilization? Romulus and Remus were supposedly raised by a wolf in a cave known as the Lupercal, preceding their legendary founding of Rome. Otway, pessimistic about the odds of survival and the number of planes that will search for these survivors, advocates leading the men into the forest. This is an act of questionable judgment. Yes, they are under siege and leaving the meager shelter provided by their wrecked vessel, but they are entering the wilderness, arguably entering a gauntlet to return to civilization. A trial of the human spirit, similar to a film like Gravity, which would come out about a year later. Or perhaps this is misguided thinking, leading mankind further into an icy heart of darkness. The plot eventually seems to lean towards the latter. Diaz starts to more aggressively challenge Otway's authority, doing so ineffectively and showing more self-concern than leadership. Diaz is a frustrating character, as he displays a repeated errant and faux masculine foolishness. He sits and drinks from a mini bottle of Jack Daniels, mocking the perceived pointlessness of collecting wallets and wasting time, when moments before he'd been looting them for even more pointless currency. He occupies the position of the critic, producing no new work, but pointing out flaws in thinking, sometimes worthy, sometimes not. In another movie, he would have no redeeming value, but he ends up having the strongest arc of the survivors, aside from Otway, despite it abiding his heavily foreshadowed surrender. Before the survivors leave, Hendrik leads a prayer over the bodies. He is the informal clergyman, the sentimental connection to God and the afterlife, with a reverence and a humorous plea for their survival. As they trek to the woods, the wolves descend, Mankind is exposed in the desolate space between the wild and civilization. As the wolves pick off a straggler, Flannery, Otway cannot trudge through the deep snow fast enough to assist him. This again is a formula of horror. If the survivors, knowing the threat, had stayed closer together, this would not happen. But struggling against the harsh elements led these men to allow themselves to atomize, and therein become vulnerable. The harsh wind they go through ceases the moment they reach the body, as if nature itself is conspiring against this sorry pack. Flannery's blood fills a paw print, perhaps suggesting that the blood is on nature's hands, not Otway's. Or, maybe, how one's spiritual death and suffering can be attributed to the devil's handiwork, like the demons of the Screwtape Letters. One more wallet gets added to the collection. As night falls and the wolves descend again, the survivors race to the trees. Knowing the plot, this funny enough reminds me of Breaking Bad. One bad decision cascades, leading to more, each defensible given the context, but incrementally leading deeper and deeper in the overall descent. They make a fire once more when they reach the woods, which makes sense, and the Promethean flame wards off the monsters. In the distance, we hear the alpha wolf struggling with a rival. This is immediately paralleled with Diaz challenging Otway, with Otway and the alpha both earning their status as respective leaders. This parallel shows how our worst demons mirror ourselves, and villainy is either a matter of perspective or crossing a threshold between beast and man. Diaz rejects their making spears, showing that his critiques sometimes are less substantial, undermining his ability to improve the group with his better questions. He also reveals that his status as a critic comes from the desire to survive, but he is unwilling to drop his ego and admit to being scared. Otway shows vulnerability to the others by admitting his fear, ironically against the advice of his wife in his visions, and in doing so shows himself the far superior leader, but still needs to utterly dominate Diaz physically, taking him down and disarming him of the knife he brandishes. A wolf briefly approaches the fire, interrupting the two, but not too late for the winner to be clear. Otway returns the knife to Diaz, showing generosity and forgiveness, but with a stern warning. No mas. Diaz relents and even apologizes, and he is immediately attacked by the wolf that came by the fire. It is killed with the spears, proving Otway correct on that idea. The wolf turns out to be the Omega, the loser, the last among them, sent to test not just the men, but according to Otway, Diaz specifically on behalf of the wolf pack. The men feast on this sacrifice, not just as a necessity, but as an insult to their foe. Burke displays health problems from the environment, and Diaz shouts that, "You're not the animals, we're the animals." Okay, but these wolves don't understand English, so they surely wouldn't understand the symbolism. But when Diaz cuts the head off of the Omega, and with a mocking howl, throws it out to the darkness, where the pack watches from an unseen distance, they respond with their own howls. The Alpha reveals himself atop a hill, but he does not approach them. And ultimately, the wolves prove to be more intimidating than the men when provoked. Be careful fighting demons. The men leave the fire carrying torches and journey onwards. Diaz shows his character development, now concerned about Burke's rapidly declining health, and the men make a new fire. Around this fire, the men explore the spiritual. Were they meant to live? Are they meant to die? Is what has happened ordained by the Almighty, or simply chaos? Diaz rejects the idea of God, and Otway shares this view to his surprise. Another survivor, Talget, advocates for faith. He shares a story about his daughter's hair swinging over his face and tickling him. Diaz laments his time with the regrettable hooker and brings humor and joy. And lastly, Otway speaks of his father and the poem that he wrote. The men are exploring their inner strength, determining what drives them to continue to survive. To be concluded in part 4.